All right, hello everyone. Welcome to Office Hours, where we give philosophical perspectives, formulate and explore arguments, deep dive into particular topics of your choice. Ian writes, consciousness, this is sort of a long question, so bear with me here, and I'm going to read it in full. Consciousness appears to exist on a spectrum, with various life forms falling at different levels of conscious awareness. How do we define the threshold at which something becomes meaningfully conscious? If we acknowledge that humans, due to our cognitive abilities, internal monologue, and capacity for abstraction, possess a higher form of awareness, then where do we draw the line between mere reactionary behavior and genuine self-awareness? How about language models versus plants? Plants are alive but don't seem to exhibit a mode that matches complex biological forms. But language models are extremely complex things, and yet they are not alive, but tools used at our disposal. The degrees, so he's contrasting plants, which are living but don't exhibit this complexity, but languages are complex but are clearly not alive. The degrees of selfhood are also found when a child recognizes themselves as part of the environment. There were tests done with different younger ages trying to move a cart that was attached to a rug they were standing on. The older kids got off and were able to push the cart compared to the young toddlers. We'll get to this probably towards the end of this video. Similar tests of self-awareness. Why entertain an avatar, that's a reference to the Anwei, when the total self then becomes an abstraction divorced from the real world, unless this meme or memory of ourselves is as equally important as the one that navigates and interacts in the physical realm? And question. All right, long question, a lot going on, but the question is really this: how do we define the threshold of when something is like truly meaningfully conscious versus when it's not? And a lot of the rest of that is contextualizing the question, framing sort of where he wants me to go with it, and also, and this is supplemented by some conversations that he and I have had on the side. It's a bit of a criticism of the first one, and I love this very much. This was like my dream of office hours, is being able to have the time to have these kinds of in-depth conversations where there's a bit of a back and forth. So before I address this directly, let me go over some of the criticisms of the first video. There are three main criticisms that Ian had of the first video. One is this extension of the self, and here he's talking about the inclusion the inclusion of consciousness as something kind of outside of or separate from the core of the self, but also extending in the intergenerational sense, specifically about the Anwei. He says this feels wrong somehow. And he provided but sort of by way of counterexample, a very interesting thought experiment that's apparently in some movie that's coming out soon, where a person gets copied many, many times. And it's like, are they all him? There's a weird, like, if this extension of the self outside of the body sense of identity is true, it creates all these kind of weird boundary problems. There's actually a section in Letter to Anwei called The Boundary Problem that attempts to address this. So we'll get to that. So that's problem one. There's something that feels wrong about this extension of the concept of the identity into something abstract. Second of all, he offered criticism of the Nagel essay by means of like, well, we maybe can get a sense of what it's like to be a bat. We can create like bat simulations, for example. We can have like video games, for example, where we can like play as a bat. And finally, he said like the unknowability of the consciousness in others runs into sort of empirical evidence that we seem to have, which suggests a clear delineation. There's, of course, he mentions Lara Boroditsky, who we've talked about before on this channel, but there's a famous study now going around about differences in internal monologues that people have. And some people don't have an internal monologue. And this, like, they're clearly not conscious. They're like NPCs, right? Right? So let me begin by addressing these three criticisms, which are very good criticisms, by the way. And then we'll get to the threshold questions, like where do things become meaningfully conscious, if we can answer that. So let me start with the we can know what it's like to be a bat claim, and using video games as an example. A video game simulating life as a bat actually doesn't get us any closer to knowing what it is like to be a bat. A video game meets our senses halfway. Now, we can use our creativity to try to imagine what it might be like to be a bat and then merge that with the human experience by means of this virtual reality experience. But the video game, just because we feel like we're occupying the experience of a bat, that's actually an illusion, or at least it can be. If you play a video game as a soldier, say you're playing Modern Warfare 2 or Call of Duty or Rainbow Six or any of these first-person shooter games, that does not really give you any kind of experiential insight into what it is actually like to be a soldier. You don't go through boot camp. You don't do the stupid galley cleaning make work projects. You don't have the crappy injuries that accumulate over the years of rucking too much or whatever. There's all this texture to life as a soldier that not only isn't conveyed in the video game, but might actually be experientially impossible to convey. Even in principle, the medium doesn't permit it. Right? The medium of a video game simulation does not permit the transfer of the experience of being a soldier to the player. Now, that's not to say it can't move the needle at all in that direction. But the point is, we as the user can't really know how far or even in which direction, really, we are moving in relation to the experience we think is being simulated. We have no way of knowing. And that's really the point. We have to actually experience it directly in order to know. And we can't become bats, Animorphs notwithstanding. So that's the problem with the bat video game is that it feeds into an illusion of understanding, which is not actually getting us anywhere to what Nagel is after, which is what it is actually like to be a bat. As far as I'll save the Anwei part for last. As far as actually, you know what? I think I'll address that next. So the idea that this extension of our concept of self outside of our body doesn't feel right. And that not feeling right is philosophically relevant because this feeling that we're having, the fact that we're feeling something, feels like the substance of identity. So if this part of us feels like not a part of us, that's really relevant. They're like, isn't it? In the same way that it might feel relevant if a part of our limb didn't feel like ours. We would call this derealization syndrome. It's a pathology. You can go find it on Mayo Clinic. Like, that's a problem if your body doesn't feel like yours. It's a very uncomfortable experience. Maybe some of you have felt that after too much sleep deprivation or certain kinds of drugs or too much internet use. It can do that. So what do we make of this separation that we have between what I'm claiming to be a part of our identity, which is this Anwei, this intergenerational line, and our experience of it? Well, excuse me. When we think about other social animals. And let's cut the intergenerational part out for the sake of exploring this concept. When we think about other social animals, the evolution of those animals and how they function in nature is dependent upon their social organization. It doesn't make sense, for example, to imagine like what is an individual ant and how does an individual ant survive as an individual ant. Never mind the colony. Don't worry about the colony. Tell me about this individual ant. You're not going to understand the individual ant outside of the context of the colony. That's not how that insect works, right? Now, we humans are not ants. We're not hive animals in that way exactly, but we do function socially in this matter. And our existence, like wolves or lions, where we are pack animals of that kind, and how we are unbelievable, in fact, unmatched communication skills and our instinct for communication skills, as well as our ability to run very long distances, at least in warmer weather. Wolves might have us beat in colder weather, but it's a debate for another time. Like those kinds of skills and the tool making and all this only really make sense in a social environment. Our identity is social in this way. Now, do we feel like our society? Well, I mean, generally speaking, no, right? No, we don't. But it's also possible for us to not feel like ourselves. And I mentioned derealization earlier, but there's also a positive version of not feeling like yourself, and that's called a flow state. Perhaps you've experienced this before. Matthew Crawford described this, the words put into this hypothetical line cook who has this sequence, and if he gets off time, he can do a little spin and he can hit a timer and he's back on his little sequence. And he's so attuned to his environment that his feeling expresses itself in the statement, I'm a machine. Everything feels automatic. You're tuned in. You're doing everything perfectly. You don't feel like yourself in that moment. And it's not a sense of alienation. It's a profound lack of consciousness to the point that you don't even feel alienation. You're so attentive to the things in your environment and your emotions. You're not wrapped up in what it feels like to be anything. In fact, if you had to describe retrospectively what it feels like, then the phrase he comes up with is not himself. It's a machine. So how we feel can actually vary fairly dramatically from moment to moment. And there's very negative examples of us feeling disconnected and not like other parts of ourselves. Consider, for example, the addict, right? The addict is basically at war with himself. He has this conscious understanding that this thing he's doing is killing him, and yet some other part of himself needs this thing so bad that it overpowers his conscious knowledge of it. And it's very sad to watch, right? He's just fighting a battle with himself and losing. That's addiction, right? Now, what does it feel like to be an addict? And where is the identity of the individual located in the addict? Where does the identity feel located? So it sort of breaks the question, I think, of as far as where identity is located in relation to feeling. Our consciousness, if we view consciousness as a tool, presents itself to us in, hopefully, ways that are useful to us. But that utility doesn't define us completely, given that it's changing from moment to moment, any more than like all kinds of things that we're not consciously aware of, which are a part of our body, like our the function of our intestinal system, right? Our digestive tract. Like we don't feel that consciously, but that's a very important part of us. Do we feel like our digestive tract? Well, probably not, unless there's something wrong with it. This is a very Heideggerian moment of, what's the distinction? Present at hand versus, I forget how he phrased it exactly, but he gives the example of a hammer. If you're using a hammer to hit something, you're actually not aware of the hammer at all. It feels like an extension of your body. It's just a thing in your hand. It's basically an extension of your hand. But then the hammer breaks, right? Then suddenly you're very aware of it. You're like, oh my gosh, how am I going to fix this or something? And then your awareness moves to the hammer. But you actually weren't aware of it before. You weren't thinking about the hammer. It kind of felt like a part of you, but you weren't consciously aware of the hammer until it becomes an issue. So all of this is to say, awareness and what we feel like has it is related to our identity, but it is never the totality of our identity. First of all, we can't be aware of our entire identity, even if we limited it to only our bodies at the same time. But nature provides us with many, many examples of animals, and hive animals are the easiest example of this, but by no means the only ones, but the easiest examples to illustrate the point of animals whose identity doesn't make sense except in the context of other elements that they presumably, as sentient animals, if not necessarily conscious animals, don't feel like. One ant presumably doesn't feel like another ant, but that other ant is part of its collective identity of the hive. One could just as easily ask, what does it feel like to be a skin cell? And if someone told a skin cell, you realize you're part of a larger mammalian body belonging to the hominid species, and the skin cell would be like, well, I don't feel like that. It's a very weird abstract thing. Like, well, it would be, it is kind of an abstract point. Nevertheless, it explains why the skin cell is there performing the function it is, and why it's evolved in the way that it's evolved to perform this function in relation to this body that's protecting from the outside elements. Because remember, all of our skin cells are alive in a sense, and sometimes they go rogue. That's what cancer is, right? So that's the answer to the extension of the self and the Anwei problem. And this is, as with many things in this whole domain, it's not a clean answer. There's still like a haziness to the boundaries that separate us. And with the Anwei, the intergenerational line, it gets really tricky, because it's like, do potential future partners of my grandchildren already exist within my Anwei, or it becomes kind of gray and hazy at the borders. But that haziness does not prevent us from acknowledging the explanatory power that this intergenerational identity has in explaining why we die, why some people might commit suicide, but also why interconnection and connection with other people matters so much to us and predicts our health so much and prevents us from committing suicide, and is so just generally good for us. It's because that maybe that is a part of a critical part of our identity, as evidenced by our declining health when we don't do it. And maybe our not feeling that connection is not evidence that it's not a part of our identity, but is a symptom of disconnection from something that we should be connected with. Just as, feeling a disconnection from our limb that we can see might be a symptom of some deeper problem. So that leaves the degrees of consciousness question. Like, don't we have empirical evidence for this? And this really dovetails into the actual proper question here nicely. I've already gone on quite some time just answering these criticisms. So the degrees of consciousness problem. Don't we know that some people don't have internal monologues, and doesn't that prove that they're really not all there? Um, well, actually, as I understand it, that study was basically a just bad study. It was based on self-reports. So people were asked, "Do you have an internal monologue?" And you know how many people sat there and read that question and thought, "Do I have an internal monologue? Do I? I don't think so. Do I? I don't think I do. Yeah, no, I don't have an internal monologue." Probably a lot of them, because they're self-aware, but they're not self-aware of their own self-awareness, which maybe partially answers the question, but also partially doesn't. So, like, we can be aware of one thing and not of another thing. Does that make us conscious? Does that make us NPCs? I don't know. You know, we don't have infinite attention. So if someone is paying attention to one thing but not to another, I don't think that automatically makes them not conscious, as in not having the capacity for self-awareness. So that particular study. Now, as far as Laura Boroditsky's stuff and language, uh, it should be pointed out that there almost certainly are differences in levels of consciousness, in levels of self-awareness that different people have. It would be absurd to imagine there were no differences, right? But where it gets tricky is, how do you measure that? And this is very a close cousin to the question of, where does consciousness begin? And again, unfortunately, with certainty, we can't know. We can't know where consciousness begins, for the same reason that we can't know what it's like to be a bat. And I think my favorite go-to animal example of this, my new go-to example, now that I'm thinking about it, is going to be the octopus. Because octopi are clearly, you can go, I've shown my kids videos of octopi solving puzzles and getting through mazes to get the clams and stuff. It's super fun. They are very smart, right? Very smart. But they're not social. We don't really know how to communicate with them in any ways. We can't really gauge what it's like to be them, or how self-aware they are. Exactly, we'll get to this in a second. Without doing some empathetic filling in of the blanks. And empathy is very dangerous in this in this domain, because we are projecting our own consciousness, or our own experience of the world, onto other things, perhaps without justification. We don't know. Might be the only tool we have, though. So some of the and the test that Ian gives of the kids trying to push a cart that's attached to the rug, and it's like, well, if you get off the rug, you can push it. That's very similar to a test that has become kind of the hallmark or benchmark of testing self-awareness and testing consciousness in animals, and that's what's known as the mirror test. That's right, like an animal is, walking around in an exhibit, they put like a little green dot or something on its forehead or chest or something, and then if the animal sees itself in a mirror, does it is it curious about the dot? Does it like try to do something? And there's a variety of variations on this test, but basically, can an animal recognize itself in a mirror is the idea. And many animals can pass this test. Humans are, of course, probably the best and the earliest, but I believe octopi can pass the test. Elephants can pass it. Many birds can pass it, like crows and certain parrots and things like that. So like there are all kinds of animals that can pass the mirror test. Now, there are problems with the mirror test. For example, some animals internally pass the mirror test, but they're just not interested in like exploring the dot or responding in a way we would expect, right? Which is kind of, again, a symptom of this problem. But the problems of the mirror test doesn't prevent it from being a good heuristic, a good starting point in exploring where the boundaries of consciousness might be. If you wanted a scientific answer to the question of how do we define the threshold at which something becomes meaningfully self-conscious? The mirror test is probably the best you're going to do. The mirror test is probably the best test. Now, if you're trying to gauge a person and say, is the person I'm talking to self-conscious or are they an NPC? Asking them if they have an internal monologue. If they're not self-aware, they're not going to be able to give you a correct answer. And even if they are self-aware, they might just not be paying attention to that and be wrong, but that would be less common. But something you can do, perhaps, is create a kind of verbal mirror test. And for a long time in philosophy, I've become a little bit frustrated with the way that people in debates will try to catch people out as hypocrites or advocating one thing or not in another, because so many of these contradictions are actually verbal constructions. A contradiction can be conjured based on how things are phrased and framed. It's very infrequently actually proving anything of relevance in any kind of debate. Appealing to self-contradiction is a more like a philosopher's trick than it is like, or I suppose I should say a sophistry trick, than it is like genuine interest in exploring the subject matter. Unless you hold to a coherence theory of truth, in which case you've got other problems. However, appealing to logical inconsistencies and contradictions and self-contradictions in other people's positions can be a very good way of testing how self-aware they are. You can point out, like, hey, doesn't this thing you said contradict this other thing? And this is like really easy to do in politics because everything's self-contradictory there. It's fine. But you can do it in other things, and you have to kind of spot the opportunities as they present themselves. And if someone kind of gets that like visual 404 error facial expression, that kind of deer in the headlights, and then they freeze out and then change the subject, that's probably not a very self-conscious person. But if the person recognizes the apparent contradiction and either puzzles over it, it's like, oh, let me think about that for a minute, or they say, I see what you're saying, but it's not actually a contradiction because if you phrase it this way, it's actually not a contradiction at all, whatever. Or if they just find it funny, if they find it amusing, that's a good sign. Comedy itself, and there's some danger here too, because different people have kind of niched senses of humor. So, just because someone doesn't find the things you find funny doesn't mean they don't have any sense of humor. But if you've got some common experiences, if you've got a lot of experiential points of contact with someone, their sense of humor can be a very good gauge of self-awareness and a sense of, because sensing contradictions is very similar to the sense of self-consciousness that we're talking about when we talk about consciousness. So these kinds of verbal mirror tests where you try to mirror back someone's view in a way that exposes a contradiction, again, this is not a debate tactic to try to prove them wrong, but I'm saying as a test to gauge how they respond to it, to gauge their level of self-awareness, can be very useful, perhaps. And like I was saying before, comedy can be a good gauge of this as well. I remember being in an interview, or not being in an interview, listening to an interview of Christopher Hitchens, where he had just finished explaining how he spends most of his day in a very bad mood, and he hopes that it shows. And he wants to stay in a bad mood. I want to just really deny people their the illusions and the pleasure that they might be able to get from their illusions. He thinks that it's not right that people go around enjoying these things. I might be mixing my interviews a little bit, but it was him talking about being in a very bad mood most of the time, and the audience was cracking up as he delivered each line because his delivery was so. It was comedic delivery. He had a particular cadence and pauses between each line that made it funny. And the person who came after him said that it's like, well, I was once told by a therapist that the best sign in therapy that someone is getting better is a returned sense of humor, because humor is a sign of sanity. And they thought that Christopher Hitchens was, because of his sense of humor, maybe the sanest person in the room. That the self-awareness to recognize the contradictions even as you're saying them. And I think my favorite example also from Hitchens actually was when he was asked, do we have free will? His answer was, well, of course we have free will. We have no choice but to have free will. He pauses for effect and he says, see, at least I know I'm being ironic. And the Christians say, oh, yes, you have free will. God insists upon it. Like, they don't understand that they're being the contradiction there. That kind of sense of humor is a can be a useful heuristic, I think, for gauging other people's sense of awareness. Are they an NPC, or are they kind of a newbie, or have they been in this video game of life for a few decades now? So, but I guess as far as, but again, the comedy and even the mirror test and the verbal mirror tests are subject to this fundamental hard problem of consciousness, this fundamental problem of an inability to actually properly empathize with other people without projecting. And so I will conclude this video, I think, with what might sound like a digression, but I think is actually related. What is the etymology of consciousness? Turns out it comes from the Latin com and scire. I'm sure I'm mispronouncing that, but the words mean, com is a prefix for together, and scire or scire is like to know or to understand. So conscire, I'm sure it's a hard C, I'm sure. Conscire is like to know together or to understand together. It implies a connection. And that's what's going on in our brain. Our brain is just a network of connections. When Julian Jaynes wrote The Origins of Consciousness and the Breakdown of the Bicameral Mind, that's the moment humans became conscious and aware that the internal voices they were hearing in their heads were actually themselves and not the voices of gods or dead friends or whatever. That was, he posited, the corpus callosum forming properly, connecting the right and left hemispheres of the brain. Very, very bold claim. Also a strong claim. Maybe not a provable claim, but also maybe not an unprovable claim. We don't know if it's true or not. We don't know a lot of things, turns out. But consciousness, as we understand it, implies connection with other people. It implies let me rephrase that. Implies mental connection. This is very, very Homeric. Odyssey, nous. It implies a mental connection with other people. And yeah, I'll stick with that, with other people. And those other people can be parts of yourself, right? The addict who becomes truly conscious connects his, I'm going to sound very Platonic for a moment, his appetites with his master charioteer, his logos, and brings them together to work in harmony rather than being in disharmony and in conflict with each other. They are aware of each other. The higher sort of prefrontal brain and the hindbrain appetite. Actually, hindbrain is breathing and stuff. I'm getting my neural anatomy mixed up. It doesn't matter really. It's connection of yourself with yourself and connection with others. And maybe this brings us to something like the possibility of connection with other people. And maybe this highlights the importance of going out there and experiencing things in the world. Is that you're not going to be able to relate to other people unless you've gone out and experienced enough things that you have some common experiences. And once you have gone out in the world and done things and experienced things, it will put you in a better position where you can actually connect with and understand together with other people. You can come to know their minds. And from that position, you will be in a much better place to gauge how self-aware or how conscious other people are. So, I hope that's helpful. I apologize for the incompleteness of these kinds of answers. The nature of consciousness, unfortunately, prohibits honest philosophers from, I think, giving anything like satisfying answers. But we can make do with heuristics. We can make do with things that are functional, practical, and time tried in a general sense. And going out there and experiencing things in the world, developing a sense of humor and being able to gauge other people's sense, and mirroring back, testing people's consistencies in their arguments. Not to catch them out and think that it means anything, like they're wrong if they just because they have something that can be phrased to be verbally inconsistent, but to see their reaction. Do they acknowledge and register and deal with the apparent contradiction, or does it cause them to freeze up and change the subject? So anyways, I hope that helps. I hope you enjoyed listening. Thanks so much for the fantastic follow-up question and criticisms, which are very, very fun and very, very valuable in this kind of work. So thanks all for listening, and take care.